In this first lesson, we're going to do a brief discussion of our start scene as well as seeing if we can add a mail window that's going to make our rigging process run more smoothly. The scene is called watchman_bound and it's located in the source files directory on this training disk. Now to start off, for our discussion, we do have a few layers here. One hides the majority of our character that's bound for the most part, and one holds the character assets that we have. Things like the character's nails, his buttons, all things that we really want parented to our rig, not necessarily bound. So we can go ahead and hide that for now. We'll get to those assets later. Now for our hat and shield and all those sorts of things, those aren't necessarily bound at all. Okay, we'll work on setting that hat up shortly. Okay, but when we get to things like the hair, these aren't bound at all as well. As if we can see, if we go ahead and go to shading and turn on X-ray joints, that's a really cool feature in Maya that allows us to see our bone placement. Okay, or you could simply just hit 4 wireframe to get to our the viewing of our bones. But either way, you can see that those type of assets, again, our brows, hair, and even the mustache, parented right to our head bone, okay, and even the eyes as well. And the reason being is we won't want things like our hair or eyebrows, at least for this type of character, to be bound to this bone. That's going to run into unnecessary weight painting, and any weight painting that we can avoid, the better. Okay, that's going to make things run much more convenient. So when it comes time to having these deform, like our eyebrows, mustache, we'll actually be using blend shapes. That's what we'll want to do. Alright, so now that that's explained, we also have a pretty unique bone setup going on, and there's nothing to it really. Okay, as you can see, some things are disjointed. You don't always need your joint attached directly to the rig. Okay, sometimes it works better when they're detached, and we'll get to seeing how we can set all of these things up. But if you can see, starting from our shoulder, for example, we can see that when we select the shoulder, it doesn't get to the selection of the rest of our arm. Now, the reason being, for one, this type of setup allows us to get some nice functionality out of our shoulder control when it goes to setting that up, from the connection between our shoulder and arm. So we can have more control out of our shoulder. And speaking of more control, that's going to be our goal for this kit, to see if we can get the most amount of control out of our character as we possibly can to make it more convenient for the animator. So that's going to be helpful for that, as well as when it comes to stretching the arm. This type of setup is really convenient for preserving the arm as we go to have the character's arm stretched. Sometimes if you've gone ahead and added stretch on the character's arm, you may run into some wonkiness or some skewing from the arm where the shoulder meets. And what this extra bone in here actually allows us to do, it's just the end bone of our shoulder. If we hit down arrow, a bone like this would help us to preserve this area of our shoulder. Okay, so it doesn't skew. So we have a few of setups like that. Also for our elbow, to preserve our elbow, go ahead and check that out. Hiding our character layer, we can see that there's a joint chain. Whoop, where are you going? There you are. Let's go ahead and hit F to frame you. We can see that there's a separate joint chain, and that also, again, allows us to preserve our elbow. And if you are interested in binding techniques, we do have a few kits that go over that. For one is our quadruped kit. So I do recommend checking that out if you're interested in weight painting techniques that you can use. But just added a few more here, again, for the shoulder, for the elbow, also for the wrist. If you notice, the wrist is disjointed from the rest of the arm as well. This is to help us to avoid any skewing in our fingers as we pull the control. So we'll keep our hand preserved. And it also helps us to keep our hand flat as well, so it doesn't move around as we go ahead and add the arm controls that we'll be adding later on. So those are just a few things. As we get to our legs, we can see that we have a few bones here to preserve our legs as well. And when we get to the knee, notice we've added an extra joint. This is as simple as adding another joint right underneath where you'd normally have your knee joint. You can see the placement here. This is again to preserve the knee, so that's really helpful. And then we even have a disjointed setup for our feet. And what this allows us to do is keep our feet planted, believe it or not. So as the character's upper body is pulling up, once we add that stretch, this is going to help us to keep our legs planted the way we like them to be. We don't want our feet pulling. Again, we want the most amount of control for our animators. They're going to be much more happier. Okay, so those are just a few things. I do want to mention that we are using XYZ for our joint orientation. I found that works more comfortable for this type of setup that we're doing. Okay, when we get into a more advanced setup for our torso area. Okay, and also for other things. So this is the most convenient, using the default XYZ that I found to work well. So we're going to be using that. And with these things now explained, we'll go ahead and do is show our character layer, so we can bring back the viewing of our character. And I'll also go ahead and explain our shelf that we have going on here. So all this is your basic shelf. Okay, we've called it DT Cartoon Rigging, and it holds our joint tool, it holds our IK, spline IK. We want to make sure we add that for our upper body when it gets to that. We have our hypershade and hypergraph. These are helpful for when it comes to adding our certain connections for tools that we'll be using to have our squash and stretch work in our character. Then we have our connection editor that's going to be helpful as well. Speeds up time if we don't have to use our set-driven key. And we will need to use our set-driven key at times, so we've gone ahead and added that. This is a smooth node for our character when it comes to smoothing them out and, for finalization for our character rig. Okay, we even have our distance tool. This is going to be for our limb stretch, so we'll want to make sure we add that. And then we have the rivet. The rivet is really cool. Oh, didn't want to select it, but the rivet is really cool for adding our character assets. So things like the character's buttons and the shield. Okay, we're not going to want those bound at all to the character, but rather parented in a way where they'll follow just as we need them to. So the rivet script is really cool for that. And you can find that at HighEnd3D, so highend3d.com. So I'd recommend checking that out. It could be helpful for you. But now that that's done, that's pretty much a brief discussion of what we currently have going on. This is, again, pretty much your basic character setup. Okay, all there is a few more joints to preserve a few areas of our character bind. But other than that, it's your basic setup, and you can go through and check out the bind we currently have on the character, and it may not look too well just by testing it out, but once we start adding those controls, everything will come together the way we need it to, so we don't need to worry about that at all. So once this discussion has been done, what we can do is stop the lesson here. In the next lesson, we're going to spend some time working on that window, that mail window, that's going to make it more convenient for us.